Tonight's author is presenting a very new topic for us down here in the children's department. We're used to hearing authors who present their books on potty training or teenage angst.
I can talk about that.
Yeah. Or even books about dystopian governments, or books where bears are the main characters. But this is a new one for us, so welcome. Bonnie is a former parenting columnist for Time magazine and has written for numerous other publications, including the New York Times Magazine, the Wall Street Journal, Slate, the Boston Globe, and even O, the Oprah magazine. She's written on topics ranging everywhere from gun safety and genetics to male doulas, tattoo parlors, and bars that double as churches. Her latest publication, The Gene Machine, has received a Publishers Weekly starred review and aims to discuss the new frontiers of gene technology and how that hot topic can and will change medicine, bioethics, and family dynamic. So, no introduction needed, I think. We're all friendly here. But Ms. Bonnie Rochman.
Thank you. Thanks to everyone. Thank you so much for coming. It's great to be here and to see so many people who I haven't seen for a long time and others who are part of my family. So I'm going to tell you how this book came out, and to start the story I'm going to have to go back to my college graduation. That's me. I graduated from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill in 1994, and 1994 was a really significant year for UNC because it was its bicentennial, which was also significant because UNC is the oldest public university in the nation. So we were fully expecting a really impressive speaker. Previous classes had heard Madeleine Albright, Desmond Tutu, so we were wondering, okay, who are we going to get? And then it was announced some guy named Francis Collins. No one knew who he was. None of my friends knew who he was. I didn't know who he was. And then when we started reading about him, he was at the time director of something called the National Human Genome Research Institute, which sort of sounded like science fiction. And he was engaged in a campaign, an odyssey, to articulate all 3 billion base pairs of the human genome, or the genetic code. And I have to say, it sounded really remote, not exactly the kind of inspirational speaker that you want to send you off into your post-college years. Anyway, nevertheless, he actually gave a great speech. We all went out into the world. Fast forward 15 years, he did such a good job at NHGRI, the Human Genome Research Institute, that he was named in 2009 head of the National Institutes of Health, which is a pretty prestigious position. It's our nation's medical research agency. And that year was also the same year that I started writing about health and parenting for Time magazine. So I had a column. It was called Family Matters. I often have slides, but we didn't have that in this intimate space. And I got to write about a lot of fun things, some of which Allison ticked off for you. I wrote about Beyonce and her promotion of public breastfeeding and how parents influence their friends' decision whether or not to vaccinate their kids. I wrote about DNA tests to try and determine aptitude for sports in children, which is really not very science-based. And I wrote about parents deciding to share their genetic testing results with their children. So I've been doing this for about 6 months, this job, when a really interesting study landed in my inbox. And it had to do with a bunch of parents who had kids under the age of 18, and they were asked if, in theory, they would want to test their children for some pretty common adult onset diseases like diabetes or high cholesterol or high blood pressure. And pretty much across the board, all these parents said, definitely, bring it on, we want to do this, we're sure we'll get, that doesn't run in our family, so we're sure we'll feel really reassured, and all will be well, and we'll move on. And what they didn't know, and what the study showed, was that these adult onset conditions are so common that in general, most of these kids would have about 9 different genetic mutations predisposing them to develop these conditions later on in life. So there was this real disconnect between what the parents thought would happen and what they understood about genetics and what the reality was. So that made me start thinking about the fact that genes are not black and white. I mean, in some situations they are, but in so many cases it's really not cut and dried. There's this misconception that genes are destiny. And sometimes they are, but in many cases they're just part of a puzzle. So I was really intrigued by this multidimensional aspect of DNA and what it all meant. And so I ended up pitching a story about sequencing children's genomes to my editor, and she really liked it, so she pitched it to her editor. And it ended up becoming a week-long online series for Time.com. And it did really well, so then we decided, well, I didn't decide anything, I was just the reporter, but powers that be, many levels above me, decided that we would condense it into a cover story. So it was the last cover story of 2012, and you know, sometimes when you spend a lot of time on a project, you either never want to hear about it again or you're even more intrigued. And so for me, it was the latter. So I decided, why not write a book? So I started my research for this book about all these cutting edge technologies that offer access and ways to peer inside our genomes, inside our genetic code. And I wanted to do this not just in a textbooky kind of way for clinicians, but to do it in a way that would interest moms and dads and people who are just interested in how science is reshaping society. So that meant I had to tell the stories of real people. And this is one of the stories that I tell. This is one of the real people in the book. Her name is Gracie. She has Down syndrome, and she lives outside of Boston. Gracie is, her life is pretty darn good. She is really funny, she is a diligent learner, and thanks to her mom, she's included in inclusion classes. And she's also really charmingly irreverent. So one of my favorite stories in the book is Gracie's mom telling me about Gracie's first trip to the dentist. So the dentist was trying to disarm her and telling her how cute she is, which she is. She's super adorable. And so the dentist said to her, oh, you're so cute. Can you open your mouth, cute little girl? And Gracie, because keep in mind, kids with Down syndrome, any kids, right? They don't always know exactly what's socially appropriate. So Gracie responded, get away from me, you. Word that rhymes with clucking witch. So obviously Gracie's mom was completely mortified, but a friend of Gracie's mom commented that Gracie was just simply saying what everyone else is actually thinking. So there is now some really fascinating research, ongoing research into prenatal therapies to boost cognition in people with Down syndrome. Some of it is actually conducted right here in DC in labs at the National Human Genome Research Institute. There is work going on about silencing the extra chromosome that characterizes Down syndrome. There's work going on about drugs that can be taken prenatally by pregnant women or after birth by children or older kids who have Down syndrome. And as you might imagine, some parents are really, really excited about this and some parents are really conflicted. Melanie is Gracie's mom. She happens to be one of those parents who she's just not certain how she feels about it. So like all parents, she wants Gracie to have every opportunity, but that really raises the question of what it means to have every opportunity and what is the difference between helping your child achieve her potential and changing your child. So that's one of the questions that I address in the book. So we're going to just do a quick little pop quiz. If you had the choice, if you were able to decide, do you think it's good, bad, or inconsequential to have a child who's born blind or missing a limb or with an intellectual disability? So is there anyone who thinks that it's good? Anyone who thinks it's bad? What about inconsequential? It doesn't really matter one way or another. So this is an interesting bunch. Most people usually overwhelmingly say bad, and I think in this situation more people said it didn't matter. There's a professor in the book who studies eugenics, and he said that he has taught this over and over and over, and he says that if he did a survey of most people who he knows, who he feels are compassionate and not mean-spirited, that most people would actually say there are some conditions that children really shouldn't be born with if there's actually a way that we could avoid that. And I find that thought really powerful. So, we we like to think about ourselves that we're open-minded and we're open-hearted. But when we're asked about disability, given the option, many people would say no thanks. So there is actually a way currently to eliminate disability. This is a picture of preimplantation genetic diagnosis. So that's an embryo, and that's a couple cells being siphoned off for analysis. And preimplantation genetic diagnosis, it's known for short as PGD, is a way to select an embryo. So what you do is you're not changing the embryos, but editing them, which is something that's been in the news a lot lately, because just last month the National Academy of Medicine and the National Academy of Sciences issued a pretty surprising statement saying that for the first time they actually came out and said that it would be okay in very specific circumstances if a couple really wants to have a genetically related child and there's no other way for them to have a child who's not affected by a severe disability or disease, that it could be okay to edit genes, and maybe there should be clinical trials, research to look at that. So that upset quite a few people. I'm sure everyone has heard the term designer babies. Mm-hmm. So when people start talking about editing eggs or sperm or embryos, there's a lot of conversation about, designer babies. And what does that mean to be a designer baby? So I want to make it really clear that the panel was not talking about enhancing children, making them smarter, or faster, or sweeter. We don't know how to enhance embryos at this point in time. We don't know how to create the next Simone Biles or the next Yo-Yo Ma, nor do we know how to eliminate extreme stubbornness. This is a great cartoon that you guys probably can't see, but it says, it appears, this is a doctor saying, it appears you both have a gene that causes extreme stubbornness. Would you like me to remove that so your child does not inherit it? And the dad says yes, and the mom says no. So gene editing is very different from preimplantation genetic diagnosis. So with PGD, you're not actually changing the embryo. You're just saying, okay, here we have a bunch of embryos, and let's look at the ones that have this particular gene mutation that we're trying to eliminate. And then you set those embryos aside, you don't use them, and you would only transfer the ones that don't have that particular mutation. So it's been used, this technology has been used for decades to avoid the transmission of very serious and often fatal diseases like Tay-Sachs. But it has started to become used more commonly for a disease such as breast cancer. And that can prove really complicated and pretty controversial, because breast cancer is a disease that if you have a mutation if you have a BRCA mutation, a gene mutation, it means that you are at significantly greater risk of developing cancer, but you won't necessarily get it. And moreover, unlike a disease such as Tay-Sachs, which is fatal in childhood, there are things you can do. You can do increased surveillance. You could pull an Angelina Jolie and have a prophylactic mastectomy. There are lots of things that you can do to really stay on top of that and guard against either developing cancer or catching it at an early stage if it does develop. So we have a really special guest in the audience. This is Susan Davis, and she and her daughter are in chapter 2 of the book. I'm going to read a little bit about her story, if that's okay.
Yeah,
with
that's
you.
fine. And she will be here.
Okay.
She must be a victim as well.
So this is from the chapter called Playing God. In 2009, Jennifer Davis and her mother, Susan, spoke to a graduate-level bioethics class at Georgetown. The mother-daughter duo often are asked to do this kind of public speaking to put a human face on the sorts of agonizing decisions that arise from knowing you're at risk of getting cancer. The Davises, who live in the suburbs of Washington, D.C., are part of a generations-long chain of women in their family who carry the BRCA1 mutation. This mutation ups their likelihood of getting breast cancer more than 5-fold compared to the average woman's 12% risk, and it ups their likelihood of getting ovarian cancer to 39%, in contrast to the 1.3% of chance of a woman in the general population. The mother and daughter have traced their family's cancer history back to Jennifer's maternal great-grandmother, Ethel, who died of breast cancer in 1930 at age 32. She'd been diagnosed 4 years earlier and had a crude mastectomy. When Susan gives talks, she brings along a sepia-toned photograph of Ethel, dark hair drawn back into a loose bun, staring past her husband in the posed inscrutability that used to characterize formal photography. Neither is smiling. Susan follows that with a picture of Ethel's children, Marjorie and Mary Ann, 2 chubby-legged pixie-cut girls in bobby socks and Mary Janes. They were 3 and 4 years old when their mother died. In 1970, in her early 40s, Marjorie, Susan's mother, had a benign mass removed from one breast. In 1980, Mary Ann, Susan's aunt, was diagnosed with cancer in one breast. She was 54. 2 years later, she received the same diagnosis in her second breast. 2 years after that, Mary Ann's daughter, Barbara, who was 38, repeated the pattern. Barbara's cancer spread to her brain and killed her in 1990, 6 weeks after her mother succumbed to ovarian cancer. It went on and on and on. Susan went on to develop breast cancer. Jennifer had questionable lumps that led her to choose a prophylactic mastectomy. The bad news came so frequently that it was hard to keep track of who was getting diagnosed with what and where and when. So Susan created a chart. Each time a relative died, she put a black X over the icon representing her. The chart, or pedigree, served as pictorial confirmation of what she and her daughter already knew. In short, if you had to pick a family to be a part of based on family health history, this was not one you choose to join. That much was clear to the Georgetown bioethics students, one of whom decided to throw propriety aside and follow up that unassailable line of inquiry. Say you had the ability to end this legacy, the student said. Would you? So what follows is a conversation about preimplantation genetic diagnosis. And Susan was pretty appalled at the idea of it, because if she had done that, she wouldn't have her daughter Jennifer, who's standing right next to her. Jennifer, on the other hand, said, yeah, I would do that, because cancer it had just wreaked such havoc in her family, and she felt like, well, here's a technology, and I definitely would take advantage of that, or at least I think I would. And so here, same family, mother, daughter, they have such different ideas about what is appropriate. So I found that really powerful. And
They were shocked.
Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
I hadn't heard of it
Yeah,
at that time.
Right.
She had, because she just happened to be taking a bioethics
Yes.
class at George Mason. So she knew what that was.
Yeah.
And all I could think was, I had 2 children and they both have this
Yeah.
mutation. If I had done that, I
They wouldn't
have
be
either
here.
one.
Right, exactly. So you can see how complicated this is. There's monitor, there's screening, it's risk, it's not certainty. Are you playing God? Some people think yes. On the other hand, if you can rewrite a tragic history, why wouldn't you? So now let's change that scenario a little bit. Say we're not doing, preimplantation genetic diagnosis. Would you want to actually know if your baby has a breast cancer mutation? So currently, there's no testing of kids under 18 unless it's medically necessary. So you wouldn't just test a baby willy-nilly for a BRCA mutation just because
Except
you're
for
curious. Yes, right.
pre-implantation,
But
or
and
you
then
gotta
you would
wait
test
until they're
exactly. Then you would test
yeah.
right. So you're just not under 18. You're not sharing this information with families. So there are all these different complicated values, different complicated perspectives on the value and the appropriateness of information. So there are more and more ethical dilemmas as this technology evolves. I'm not a scientist, I'm not a doctor, I like to think of myself as a humanist, and I wrote this book because I'm really fascinated by these questions of right and wrong, and who decides where the red line is. Is there a red line? When does the red line move? Who draws it? And nowhere is this more apparent and more heated than when it comes to making babies. So these are really big ideas. I don't give answers. I don't think there are any that I myself would be authorized to give. I think they're very individual. It's really personal. So next time you're sick of small talk at a cocktail party, you can try some of these topics on Prose. Do parents have a right to all of their child's health data? So some doctors think that it's just a matter of time until everyone's genome is in the cloud. And is that right? Should a parent be able to know all about their child's DNA? And let's say that there is a problem that will manifest years, decades down the road. Would that make you love your child more or less? Now let's go back to that BRCA mutation. Say your newborn does have her genome sequence, which is being done at 4 academic institutions throughout the country, just on a research basis. And let's say that a BRCA mutation is discovered. So we just said, we don't tell parents that because it's adult onset and it's really not appropriate. There's nothing you can do. A baby girl, for example, doesn't have breasts. There's nothing to do about it. But what if the parents have the mutation, which they likely do, one of them has it and has passed it on to say, a baby girl, and you don't tell the parents and they don't know that they have the mutation, and then say it's the mom, and the mom goes on to develop cancer, let's say it's really aggressive, and the mom dies. So telling the mom would obviously be a way to save her life, and I can't think of anything more important to do to protect the health and well-being and safety of a child than to ensure that her mom is there to help raise her. So on the other hand, you can see exactly why you wouldn't want to tell parents, because it would create an incredible amount of anxiety and there's nothing to do for years down the road. So anyway, cocktail party conversation. So in short, it used to be a lot easier to be pregnant. My mom didn't even know if I was a boy or a girl when I was born. And today there is just tons of data. So how do we make informed decisions about pregnancy if we find genetic blips that just aren't really clear? In the book I go into a situation that I had with my daughter where I had an amniocentesis to rule out a severe genetic condition, and thankfully that was fine, but then I got other information that her 9th chromosome is flipped, and it's supposed to be benign, not supposed to have any, the lab report basically said don't worry about it, but of course I'm going to worry about it. So, the more that we do genetic testing and the more that this is incorporated into healthcare, the more people who are going to find, who are going to discover unexpected results, unanticipated results, and things that they just really don't understand and may not welcome. A lot of people will say, okay, is this too much information? Are we sharing too much information? Is this inappropriate? I actually disagree. I think that we live in this incredible time in which science and technology are converging to open a window into who we are and who our children are at their most elemental cellular level. And it's important to be informed and to go into this with our eyes wide open. So I'm going to end with the best compliment I got about this book to date, which is going to involve telling you a little bit about how books get made. So all these blurbs on the back of the book, they don't just happen organically. It's this really awful, humiliating process of collaborating with your editor. You know what I'm talking about, Charles. Collaborating with your editor and thinking, okay, who would the best people be to write an endorsement for the back of the book? And if they're good enough to write an endorsement for the back of your book, they're usually important and really busy. So you're asking these people who are already really busy to become even busier by taking the time to read your book and write some hopefully nice words about it. So one of the people I asked had just written a memoir with her husband called Juniper about her very premature baby. And I reached out to her, said the appropriate praiseworthy things about her memoir, which I didn't have to make up. It truly was wonderful. So I followed up with her for the first time on October 26th. And she wrote back to me and said, just got the book and haven't looked at it yet, but I'm looking forward to it. So I wrote back, ugh, isn't this blurb seeking just the worst? I appreciate your making the effort, Kelly. And the next day she wrote back, the whole book promotion thing, ugh, standing naked on the street corner would be more fun. So I upped the ante, because this is all sort of a wooing process. I'm like, oh, she likes me. Let me keep this going. So I wrote, more like standing naked on the street corner in sub-zero temps in Times Square. That would only begin to capture the horror. And then she went radio silent on me. So I'm really stewing. I decided finally after a week it was appropriate to check in. So I wrote, hello fellow naked street corner dweller. I'm gritting my teeth and also casually checking in to see if you might just be inclined to blurb this book of mine. Time dragged by. There was no word. And then finally I got an email from her, 10 words total. This book doesn't suck. Thank God, that would have been awkward. So I laughed, and I wrote back to her, that's the blurb right there. This book doesn't suck. And then Kelly actually had the last word, which I think is really a universal truth that transcends book writing. She wrote, really, that's all any of us can ever hope for. So I hope you like the book and you find it interesting, and I hope that it makes you think about things that you haven't thought about before, things like science and babies, and how those two things intersect in ways both marvelous and mysterious. And thank you so much for coming. And I'm happy
Other questions?
So now that the book is a book and you've done the research for the book, are you still working on the genetics? What is your interest? Where is it leading you to?
That's a great question. A lot of people have been asking me what's next, and I need to come up with a better answer. So for now, I'm just trying to get the word out about the book. I'm really hoping that families will find it, so I'm trying to spread the word to genetic counselors. And I still love, even after writing a book, I'm still really fascinated by genetics. So I definitely want to keep writing about it. In fact, one of the doctors who I interviewed in the book, he had a suggestion that I had to talk him down from. But he said, you know, when you finish this book, we should collaborate. We should do a coffee table book about birth defects. And I said, what do you mean? And he said, well, I've delivered all sorts of, crazy, really interesting things. Like, babies can be born with tails. Babies can be born with one eye. And how does this all happen? And I said, wow, that's really fascinating, but it's not a coffee table book. So who knows? I might explore that further. But I'm not exactly sure where I'll go next. But I think I will have something to do with genetics.
Hi. So I used to work with this fantastic dear geneticist whose motto was, don't pick your nose if you don't know what you're going to do with it. And I read your book, it was fantastic. Rather than sequencing the entire genome, did you talk to anybody who would advocate for targeted testing and then reserving the samples for later on were additional testing to be needed? Because it's hard for me to imagine a scenario where you would want the whole thing, but I'm maybe a little bit small-minded about it.
Yeah. Well, so, there's one part in the book where, let me back up a little bit. So, in many cases, full genome sequencing is done. In fact, there was just research coming out of this conference where I was a genetics conference that I just attended, saying that genome sequencing is actually better than exome sequencing. Although I think for quite a while, many doctors were thinking exome, which is just the protein coding part of the genome, that was sufficient. But now they're saying, oh, you can actually find much more information by sequencing the whole genome. So but it's really done mostly in cases to crack medical mysteries. So in that case, they're throwing open the floodgates because they're really trying to find out why a child is sick. In the situation of newborn sequencing, I don't really see that becoming commonplace so quickly because of what you say. There is so much information that can be gleaned and kind of, in some situations it's almost like too much, and what do we do with all that information? But there is this really interesting software that allows people to kind of plunk their genome sequencing results into it. It's actually out of the University of Washington. It's called My46, after 46 chromosomes. And so what's really interesting about it is it dives into this whole, there's a lot of debate about, well, share the data. How much data, does this data belong to you? How much data should we be revealing? Should the doctors be keeping it? And how much can I focus on parents, but so how much can parents handle, but how much can people handle in general? And there seems to be a move toward sharing more data, and I think one really smart way to do it is, instead of just dumping it all and kind of opening the floodgates, if you use this technology, you're allowed to it's like there are kind of drawers, and you can say, okay, well, I only want childhood onset conditions. I don't want to know, like for a baby, I don't want to know about anything adult onset. I don't want to know about cancer. I do want to know about, or I don't want to know about breast cancer, but I do want to know about, lung cancer because my, father had it, and my father wasn't a smoker, so I want to know what's going on with that. So you're kind of able to pick and choose, and it gives you control over it. So you still get all your data, but it's not necessarily shoved down your throat. I hope that answered your question.
Hi, I really love the book.
Oh, thank you.
It was a gift from I just started working with the patient advocacy group for Trisomy 18 Foundation. And so that's another chromosomal anomaly that needs a lot of research. It's pretty common, it's very similar to Down syndrome. And we have a daughter with trisomy 18, and she's one of the unusual and the long-term survivor because she's 6 years old. But I was really interested in the book with the patient's attitude to the research that came out about being able to silence the extra chromosome.
Yeah.
And the pushback from the patients that say, no, don't do that,
Yeah.
that takes away from the individual.
Right.
But I was hoping you can comment a little bit more on that, because usually with these afflictions you have all sorts of medical complications and pain,
Yeah.
like our daughter's had heart surgery, spinal surgery,
Right.
cancer, and liver surgery. So you have all this, and I'm baffled by other parents that would say, don't shut down the extra chromosome because it's going to change my child.
Right.
But if you look at the medical suffering, I should say, that afflicts these children, I don't know how you can argue that, and I wish you can comment a little bit more about that.
Yeah.
To get parents on the same page to help with this.
Right. Well, it's really, I don't mean to sort of back away from your question, but I think it's really complicated. So most parents who I spoke with, so just, a small slice, I didn't do a research study or anything, but they would be very open to drugs or medical interventions that would help mitigate the medical symptoms of their child's condition, but they worry about changing personality and changing temperament, and they feel like they think, okay, well, again, where's the red line? What's okay to do and what's not okay to do? So personally, I feel like after talking to a lot of these researchers, they were very clear that their research is not intended to basically create a new kid. That it's like in the same way that if you have diabetes, you're not going to not treat your condition. So they're treating the symptoms. In some cases, they're trying to, for example, boost memory, which can be an issue for kids with Down syndrome. I don't know, I don't know the specifics about trisomy 18, but they're trying to, to really address the medical symptoms and not the personality. So I don't know why it is such an issue for them. I just think they're worried. They feel like, I also think there's an element of feeling judged, because sort of in another sentiment that I encountered within the special needs community is parents almost across the board will say, I love my child just the way she is. And they feel like it's not okay. I know maybe it's painful to admit that actually you wish your child were, you could make them a little different. But I think parents of typically developing kids do that all the time. I mean, I know I do that with my own kids. I mean, that's why, I talk about in the book, my son started playing violin when he was 4 and a half, and it wasn't like I was trying to make him a concert violinist. I mean, he expressed interest in it, but yeah, everyone knows, oh yes, music is good for your brain. So I felt like, oh yes, this will be good for him. So everyone's always trying to sort of, make their child the best that their child can be.
I feel like there's some cognitive dissonance when parents feel conflicted and saying, you know what, yes, let's do this. And,
right.
But I hope there's a way we can bridge that gap and
Yeah.
have parents on the same page.
Right.
So let's support this
Right.
research.
I think as the research advances and the results become clearer, that I would expect that the cognitive
In that
dissonance would
chapter, I was
lessen.
like, oh my gosh. So it's interesting.
Thank you for sharing your story.
Hi Bonnie, welcome to
Sure.
Washington DC.
Thank you.
Bonnie has some colleagues here from her previous newspapers. I'm curious whether there are medical schools that are grappling with this at the level of let's send freshly made doctors out into the world. I mean, just the little example you gave of, we know that this newborn has BRCA1. What if her mother doesn't know that she has it too? Well, boy, when your kid is the kid being tested, you want a physician who's thought about it for more than 5 minutes.
Right.
And so I'm curious whether this is part of medical school curriculums. Are there places that do it well? Who's thinking about it at that level?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. I have to be honest, I don't know the details of that, but what I can say is just when I was at this medical genetics conference, I was speaking with a lot of genetic counselors and geneticists, and pretty much across the board, they bemoan the fact that OBGYNs don't know much about genetics. So I sat in on a med school class. I live in Seattle, so I sat in. A friend who is a geneticist invited me to sit in on it's like genetics 101 for a first year. It might be second year. I think it's first year med students though, and that's it. That is all the genetics training that these med school students get. No, regardless, they haven't yet chosen their specialty. So they're going out into the world, and I think that there's a disconnect between how integrated genetics and genomics is becoming in healthcare and what physicians are being prepared to do. So I don't specifically know the question about how medical schools are addressing that. I know that there are some doctors in the audience who might know the answer to that. So if someone has insight, feel free to take it away.
Any doctors?
It's really taught more in subspecialty training, genetics training, which usually people go through the pediatrics path and then to genetics, but you could go through other paths as
Right.
well. But it's usually done more in subspecialty training. The maternal fetal medicine physicians
Right.
are probably more familiar, but they have additional training past the regular OBGYN
Right.
training.
Right.
It's probably something medical schools should do better.
Yeah.
Yeah, although that,
Do they do the science or the?
Yes.
they do both. So I mean, they do the science, and then there's also, in almost every medical school I know of, there's typically a required course in medical ethics and biomedical ethics, and so they also get to consider those kinds of questions, the sort of thornier, these questions have no real answer type questions, so that they've at least contemplated these types of things. But I can tell you that it's also rather controversial. In general, medical school curriculums require a lot of different topics, and some of those topics take longer than others, and so being able to incorporate everything that you'd want a doctor to know over the course of what is a finite period of time is something that I know that several people I know in medical education are constantly grappling with in terms of how to distribute that time most appropriately.
I do think that, again, when I was at this conference, I was speaking to a carrier, I was at the booth of a carrier screening company, and they said that even for example, maternal fetal medicine specialists, they are very interested in knowing only about things like trisomies, so like Down syndrome or trisomy 18. So they want to know just about the genetics of that. And so different medical specialties are interested in different things, but I don't know that anyone's doing a really good job of giving a holistic overview of
And
genetics.
part of the reason for that is just because there are only certain things that you can even see that early in a pregnancy when you do a karyotype. So
Right.
there are things, I mean, so many of the things that people care about are not the kinds of things that you sort of typically go out of your way to look for at that time in a pregnancy.
I'm looking forward to reading your book.
Thank you.
Again. And I appreciate you're not a doctor, but I'm just interested. So I've gone through genetic testing, and I was required to meet with a genetic counselor before I did it. In fact, there were multiple meetings. I couldn't just do it once. I think we met 2 or 3 times. So I'm just wondering if a parent wants to have this genetic, are they required to meet with a genetic counselor, or can they just go ahead and launch and get the genome sequenced, or how does that, I mean, because
Yeah.
I couldn't do it. And I'm glad I did. It was really helpful to
Yeah.
meet with the genetic counselor.
Right.
It just seems like this is an incredible amount of information to absorb if you don't have someone providing counseling and giving you guidance to prepare you for what's coming.
Yes. So I'm in love with genetic counselors. I think that they're so critical, and there aren't enough of them. In fact, if there's anyone here who's trying to decide what to study, definitely go into genetic counseling. I was just talking to lots of trainees, and they all, months before they're ready to graduate, they all have jobs already. There is direct-to-consumer testing, but I think that there has been a shift toward a lot of places have started out really pushing direct-to-consumer testing, and now there's been a backlash, and I think the medical community and industry really is recognizing the value of counseling, because people were getting all this information and they weren't sure what it meant. So, but with that said, genetic counselors exist. They're here in Washington, D.C., but they're not in Washington, North Carolina, which is a tiny little town. So it depends where you are in the country that can really determine your access. And so what you have is this real disparity. So women who want to be pregnant or are pregnant in a major metropolitan area have access to lots of genetic counseling and really good information, and women in smaller communities may not even know that it's an option. Yeah.
I'll just offer a comment to you that I learned the hard way when I was diagnosed with cancer in 2003. I mean, I already had all these other people in the family that had had either ovarian or breast cancer and had passed away. So the test came out in 1994, but we didn't know that. We just thought our family had a whole lot of bad luck. I didn't know. So when I got cancer, it was the oncologist that asked me, did I want to do genetic testing? And I said, there's a test. And he said, yes. And so he did it. And of course, it came back positive. When you get that, it has that paragraph at the bottom with these horrible statistics, 87% chance of breast cancer, almost 50 for ovarian. And there was some other data that I wanted to understand how that happened. And years later, I found out what should have happened was when he asked me what my family history was, he should have then sent me to a genetic counselor so that she could explain, well, they'll first ask you about your relatives, who in your family has had disease and at what age were they diagnosed. And from that, they pick the type of test that you should have. But now they're getting into these great big panel tests that can do 45, 50 different genes. But it wasn't that way for me. And since that time, in my capacity as an outreach coordinator for a nonprofit for the people with this mutation, if they're approaching the point where they're thinking about testing, the thing I always say to them is, okay, if you think that's what you want to do, and you ever thought you wanted life insurance, go get that first, then test. Because you won't get it afterward. So we learned that the hard way.
But isn't that information, it's covered under medical privacy? I mean, you can't
It's
disclose that.
supposed to be, but I've had people tell me it's not ever totally.
Yeah, health insurance is protected.
And the insurance companies ask you if you have those conditions.
Yes.
So if you know and then lie, then when you invoke the insurance, they say you lied.
If they know.
If they
They
can
can
figure it
find
out.
out. That was the issue we were worried about. So many people in our family, we had 16 positive people. So all week we've been watching the news, hoping the pre-existing thing was gonna be not an issue for us, because that was really bad.
There's also a lot of reason to be cynical about sort of information in that way. I remember it wasn't too long ago that as part of a scientific paper, part of somebody's genome was actually published, and then somebody actually figured out who that person was.
Well,
Yeah, I mean, so it gives you a sense for just how potentially,
Yeah.
corruptible the.
Well, my daughter and I like to joke, we've been on every TV channel, we've been on Nightline, we've been out there blasting this to people.
Sure.
No
Yeah.
more hiding it in our family, but, the younger generation, the women in their 30s in my family, they're the ones that have the worries. And the comment about doctors, we have found that doctors that have already been in practice for decades may not know very much, and you may not see anything in their waiting rooms about hereditary cancer, which is what I had hoped. So once I became part of Force, I made sure that I gave doctors that I knew things that they could put in the waiting room so that people would pick it up and maybe ask questions. Because in my mind, as I told my nieces and my daughter, you all have a tool that I didn't have. You don't want to wait for cancer and then find out you're positive. You want to find out you're positive and think about what you want to do about it.
Allison.
So this discussion that we're having right now, I think is a good segue into the question that I had, which is, what's been your experience during the research for the book about insight into the future of public policy, healthcare, public education, et cetera? For example, my wife and I have a family member who has a disability, and luckily that family member's been able to have a fairly fulfilling life, thanks to a lot of different public programs like the ADA Act, special education, et cetera. And one of the things that I'm hearing in the discussion right now is that, even though the individual choice to engage in things like genetic screening, genetic filtering, et cetera, right now is an individual choice. I can easily imagine at an abstract political level or at a shareholder level for health insurance companies that once these technologies are out on the table, an individual's choice will be kind of forced because you chose to not engage in this filtering or this genetic editing, et cetera. Well, why should we give you access to these resources,
Right,
et cetera?
right.
In your research for the book, did you encounter any discussions about that inside of that process?
In my research, I focused more on inequities, which I think is related to what you're talking about. I think there's a significant amount of concern among people in the disability, have kids with disabilities and special needs now about where things stand, especially within the Department of Education, what is guaranteed and what really do the people in charge actually know about what the law stipulates about what kids with special needs are entitled to. As far as genetic testing goes, I think the public policy discussions, what interests me a lot about them is how they're really poised to potentially create more socioeconomic inequity. Because when you think about, healthcare is already quite inequitable. People who have money have access to better healthcare. And when you think about even something like sequencing your genome, well, the cost has dropped exponentially, but when you think back, I think the first time I actually really heard about it sort of in the media was when Steve Jobs had his genome and his tumor sequenced. I think it cost $100,000, and I don't know anyone other than a small handful of people who could have afforded that then or could afford that. Yeah, so he,
Did
well,
he
you know,
find out?
he didn't find out anything that changed the course of his treatment or his life.
Is there any discussion going on by insurance companies as to whether there's any talk of them funding any of the genetic testing?
Yeah, they do. I mean,
Are they funding any of it now?
They're not paying for what is. You know, there was a new term. What is explore? There's such a good term, and now I'm blanking on it. That was introduced, or at least it was introduced to me at this conference. Something about exploring your genome. Elective genome. I think that's what it was. So no, they're not paying for elective genomes. That's kind of like something you would do on your own because you're curious. But and then hospitals often have to really fight to get something like exome testing, which is again the protein coding part of your genome, or genome sequencing covered, even when it's trying to figure out. Being used to try and figure out an elusive diagnosis. So it's still, I mean, because it's a more expensive test, and so there are disparities in coverage. I expect that it will become more common as it gets more and more incorporated into healthcare. But again, who has the healthcare that will cover it? Only people who have better healthcare.
Hi, I just wanted to add a comment to that. I work for a health advocacy organization here in DC that focuses on genetics, and you would think in DC there'd be so many policy-related questions, but if you're really interested in seeing where that's going, it's actually in the wellness programs. There's a big push in terms of things that are offered, like to help you with you and your wellness, actually is providing your employer and your insurance company with a lot of information. So for those of you interested in that, that could be an area to track a little bit more. But I'm excited about the book.
Insurance companies are slow learners. Okay, they'll always say no to covering something which is new, even if it has a bona fide, genuine reason for being done. It's the same as they used to not pay for vasectomies until they decided that maybe it's better to pay for a vasectomy. It's a lot cheaper than a pregnancy. You know, so they did. In the same vein, it may come about someday that they pay for genome testing. Right now, what I am most skeptical about and afraid of, somebody alluded to this before, any doctor can order this, and there's no requirement that you go to a geneticist for counseling before you have it. But that is going to create a lot of unnecessary testing, a lot of anxiety, and a lot of tests that really don't have to be done by people who figure, I'm going to do it because it's not $100,000 now, it's $100. You know, so in that regard, maybe the insurance companies are right until the field is better sorted out.
I just, I saw an ad at this, I keep talking about this genetics conference I was at, but it was a postcard, I think it was in my bag, my welcome bag, but it was by a major sequencing company called Illumina, and they're offering a $1,900 one-day conference called Understand Your Genome, I think in August in San Diego, and I didn't give many details, but it was like, listen to eminent speakers talk about all the ethical implications, and I'm thinking, well, you could also buy my book. It's $20. Although it does only focus on parents and kids, but they're also they're going to sequence your genome. And but in one day, I didn't understand. Well, are they going to sequence? And and then they're going to give you your results later on, because the big thing with genome sequencing is not just the test. The real burden is in the interpretation. So I don't know if the $1,900, it's to me it seemed extremely whimsical, and I was very skeptical and eager also to learn more about what that is.
Hi. Sorry. So I have not read the book, and this may be covered, but I thought I would ask anyway. What are the rights of the children, and how should they be considered, and what are the policy implications of that, especially with respect to the fight for a woman's right to choose?
So I think you're sort of asking two questions. The rights, are you talking about the rights of children before they're born?
Yes.
Like during pregnancy? Okay. Well, abortion is legal in this country. And so, and a woman is free to opt for prenatal testing, any sort of testing that she wants. And if she discovers that there is an issue, she's also free to decide how to handle that. So in one of the chapters in the book, I do, it's called The Other Scarlet A, because I feel like there is, again, cognitive dissonance in terms of why people do prenatal testing, and not acknowledging the fact that abortion is a potential outcome of learning about results that most people are not anticipating. I'm sure you were not expecting to get a trisomy diagnosis. Most people just sort of, it's human nature to expect that things are going to turn out well. But again, it is a woman's right to choose what she feels is the best course of action. I do think it's important, though, to add that it is not, I feel strongly that prenatal testing is not just a fast track to abortion. And I think that I hope that there is increasing awareness that that is the case. There are a lot of really good reasons why someone may want to know, even if they don't want to terminate a pregnancy. For example, you might change the hospital you're going to deliver at to be at a place that has a higher level neonatal intensive care unit. You might switch physicians. You might align yourself with resource groups so you can connect with parents who have kids with similar conditions. So I think, and I think also a really important reason is to not be surprised on the day that you give birth. So that's one thing that I heard across the board that I'm sure you experienced. That no matter how you eventually end up processing and feeling about your child and loving your child, on that day when you find out that there's a problem, it's really awful. It's a really terrible moment. So it would be good to not, to be prepared for that.
I just want to say that I spent 30 years working with special needs children, and the sooner that you know that the child has special needs, the better the prognosis for that child is, because early intervention is fabulous. I mean, I don't know about life-threatening issues, but as far as like developmental and educational, early intervention is the way to go.
Unlike most people, like you mentioned in your book, we decided not to do prenatal testing because we did not want to be faced with making a decision like that. So we had a conscious decision, and then surprise, you have a trisomy 18 baby. But with that said, I think coming back to my original questions about patient advocacy groups and the conflict they feel on such topics, when you're faced with this baby that you're holding in your hand, it's hard to tell a parent or ask a parent whether would you want to change this or not. At that point, I think it's kind of too late.
You already love your baby.
You already love your baby, but saying, I don't want this disease to progress does not, in the population or in the rest of the population, subsequent pregnancies, I don't think that's a bad thing to do, but I think our society is still very much conflicted on it. So with that, my question goes to funding patient advocacy group and funding research for these genetic conditions that are being uncovered as time and time goes away. Health policy, public policy into funding, how is that supported? So for instance, we know a lot about trisomy 21 now because it's been such a wonderful job done by the patient advocacy groups to fund it and find out more. And you know, now this research might be able to stop the extra chromosome. Is there anything being done to provide more funding towards these genetic anomalies or chromosome anomalies to help the research? Because things like trisomy 18, they are just very, very poorly understood. And my daughter is 1 in a million, and we don't know anything. We don't know what to expect.
For starters, I can give you the name of a mom who is very active in the trisomy 18 community. So talk to me afterwards. But there are, I think one thing that I've noticed is that a lot of the time the people who do start organizations, rare disease advocacy groups, are moms and dads who have kids who are affected. I was just met yesterday. The mother of a little boy who was featured in the New Yorker several years ago, and I'd been in touch with his dad, had interviewed him over the years, but I'd never met the mom, and she was at a booth. He was, I think, the first child in the world to be diagnosed with an NGLY1 mutation, and they have really created from nothing this whole advocacy organization. I saw that they have a conference coming up, and so it's just amazing stuff. It's really done. It's very grassroots. I also, Natasha, I thought you might have something to add to that. Natasha is with Genetic Alliance, which is an umbrella organization for so many of these groups that do try to raise awareness and advocate.
You know, it really depends, like all other type of funding. I'll try to be loud. It's all about who you know and what connections you make. And there are some families who have really been able to work from a political side, whether that's at their state but also their federal level. A lot of groups recently have really been able to be active on social media, but you know, it takes a lot. You know, not everybody has the means to have someone take on basically a whole other full-time job to run an organization and to do all of that. So I think it's one of those things, sometimes you may see a line item, but a lot of those earmarks are going away, and that also causes conflict within advocacy organizations, thinking there's only one pie and I need my slice and you can't get your slice. So as an organization like Genetic Alliance, as an umbrella organization, we really try to see how do you make that pie bigger and not think about earmarks, because those earmarks then go away and what are you going to do? But it's really tough and only getting tougher.
Do you know the stories behind myriad genetics?
In terms of the BRCA fight?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Myriad Genetics is the company. It was the only lab in the country for a long, long time, until just 2 years ago or so, that was able to provide the BRCA mutation testing. And the reason was because the person who ran that lab had a patent on the BRCA1 and the BRCA2 genes. So he's sending out all these tests and collecting all this data on all these people for years and years, and he's not sharing it with the research community. So for people like us, that could have helped us a long time ago. Well, they were finally taken to the Supreme Court and lost their case and lost their patent on the genes, because you can't patent something that's found in nature. So now other companies have developed their own tests that are cheaper. And I think somebody else said something about genetic testing. If the best person in the family to test is the one that has cancer, if at all possible, if it's a mutation that involves cancer, because that would be the most expensive test. Mine was like $3,300. So, and the reason for that is they go through the entire gene looking for the position on that gene where the mutation exists. It's a number. So once you find out you're positive for a mutation, then anybody else in the family that wants to test, they're only going to look at that spot, because that's the only spot it's going to be. Those people were only $300. And if they wanted to hide the result, they paid cash.
Well, and another thing about that is we Hi, Mark's Sloan
Sloan.
is the one that found the test or discovered it, and he actually did it by doing ancestry work and following tree lines for like breast cancer and ovarian cancer. So the point out of that is it can be very helpful to just, while everybody's still alive, as much as you can of your family, collect that health history, because it's better than nothing, and then give that to your doctor. I'm Jen from the book, sorry for being late.
Well, I think that's a good place to stop. If you could fold up your chair and lean it against the wall over here on your left, and then form the line against the wall on your right.